Good morning. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this survey of the history of European art. My name is Bill Kloss, and in this first lecture, I would like to offer some ideas about looking at art, how we do it and why we do it. I start with a question. Where does one begin a historical survey course? No matter where one begins, there's always a known prelude, always the desire to begin earlier than the announced starting point. Our historical conscience taps us on the shoulder or tugs at our sleeve, urging us to look backward before marching ahead. A dear friend once reported overhearing a couple as they were leaving a museum. The woman paused in front of a painting, and her husband said, "If you stop to look at everything, we'll never get out of here." That nicely sums up the dilemma. I have decided to begin with the famous historical date of 800 AD, the year of Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor. This convenient date may be regarded as the beginning of the first true European civilization, distinct from the Roman Empire, whose dissolution several centuries before had left a power vacuum on the European continent. The ancient Greek and Roman civilizations preceded and prepared the way for the new Europe and are always its background. I will often refer to the artistic achievements of classical antiquity and their importance to European art. But our starting point will be the birth of Europe, and our chronological path will be its evolution into a coherent civilization. The 48 lectures are not evenly divided among the centuries. For example, we will survey medieval art in 9 lectures, an overview that only begins to explore an era of great creativity. In this course, medieval art is the necessary background for the next great era in European art, the Renaissance. Though only encompassing about 2 centuries, the Renaissance is, by general agreement, the central achievement of European civilization, and I will devote 17 lectures to it, including 11 on Italian art and architecture. I will discuss the Baroque era and the 18th century in a dozen lectures. This period is truly European, politically and culturally. Here we find one Europe comprised of many national powers with a shared artistic language expressed in the various national accents of Italy, Spain, Holland and Belgium, and France. The last 9 lectures will cover the 19th century and provide an introduction to the 20th century. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic period that followed it established France as the de facto capital of European art in the 19th century, and we will study its art from Romanticism through Impressionism. We have only recently left the 20th century, and we have not yet come to terms with it, and I'm speaking only of its art. I hope that our quick dip into the early years of the 20th century European art will reveal the vitality, the inventiveness, the conviction, the passion of modern art. Art history is, obviously, the study of the visual arts, including architecture, painting, sculpture, the graphic arts, of a particular period or civilization. But it is more than a recitation of famous works of art and their makers, dates, materials, subsequent history, and so on. It is also, or should be, a guide to looking, how to look at art with understanding and pleasure. I am not speaking here of technical things like paints, but of 5 elements: subject, interpretation, style, context, and emotion. Although I will address them singly, these elements always overlap and intermingle. I want to look closely with you at several works of art while referring to these elements. My aim is for you to begin to see how and why works of art affect us, that you begin to see art consciously with a fuller awareness of what you're looking at, and that you realize that looking at art requires time. If you begin to form certain habits of looking now, they will be useful and enjoyable throughout the survey. Together with the historical background, I hope that these principles or ways of looking at art will enhance your future enjoyment of art. Subject, interpretation, style, context, emotion. Every work of art has a subject. The way the subject is expressed in art is the artist's interpretation. And the artistic means of interpretation is the artist's style. Note that this is not the same as the style of a period, though it is of course related. Within the Gothic period style, each artist still has a personal style. The context can be of the moment, the events of an artist's life, of contemporary political events, the French Revolution, of the historical period, the Renaissance, or of long-term cultural determinants in Europe that would be principally Christianity. Emotion is harder to define because it's so instinctive on the part of both the artist and the viewer. We may easily misinterpret the intended emotion. The further the art is from our own time, the more easily we do so. So our own emotional response must always be tested against what we can learn of the artist and the period. But emotion is, quite naturally, a major part of our response to art. Let's focus first on subject. Renaissance men and women were fascinated with all aspects of classical Greek and Roman culture, including mythology. Artists of the Renaissance and the Baroque were especially fond of subjects drawn from mythology. The myths are so common in art that we must know these stories, if only in summary. The loves of the gods is an especially large category. The stories are entertaining in themselves and sometimes have deeper resonance. Here are two famous works with mythological subjects, and the first is Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne, painted about 1522. This brilliantly painted work is staged, really choreographed, and delicious and vivid in color and motion. It is possible to simply revel in the physical beauty of the painting, but we miss out on a much richer experience if we don't know the myth. Bacchus is the god of wine, that is widely known even today, but in the classical world, his passion was understood as the opposite of reason. The joyous procession of Bacchus and his caravan of revelers was linked to ancient fertility rites, a connection not entirely lost on Renaissance audiences. The meeting of Bacchus and Ariadne is the love story central to his myth. In this painting, leading his followers in his chariot, Bacchus discovers Ariadne abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos. Instantly smitten, he leaps, almost floats, down to her in a trance of love to make her his bride and ultimately to give her immortality as a constellation of stars already in the heavens above her. Bernini, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, carved his Apollo and Daphne about 100 years later, about 1622. If we don't know this myth, as retold by Ovid in his Metamorphoses, of Apollo's love for the nymph Daphne, then what are we to make of our observation that her fingers are changing into branches and her toes are taking root? We would know that we had a breathtaking piece of sculpture, but not know why. And if we should guess by her fearful expression or his apprehensive one that her transformation must have something to do with his pursuit, we still would not know that she has prayed for this metamorphosis in order to thwart him. There's a certain melancholy in her success because she didn't wait long enough to learn that he was a god. The story is a memorable one, and the sculpture is a magnificent expression of it in intractable marble, where such a metamorphosis seems especially impressive. Knowledge of the myth, the subject, is essential. That these two subjects were also interpreted by the artists is obvious. Obvious even if we have never seen other examples of the subjects. For instance, Bernini could have shown Daphne almost completely transformed into a laurel tree and Apollo seated dejectedly on a rock. To explore interpretation further, let's look at three versions of one subject. The subject is St. Matthew. The New Testament of the Christian Bible begins with the accounts, the Gospels, of the life of Jesus written by the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It must be understood that here, as always in our discussion of Christian art, we're taking the accounts of the saints and the biblical narratives at face value, literally, because that is what the artists did. Each of the evangelists has a symbolic figure who accompanies him or stands in for him. From early Christian times, the symbol of St. Matthew has been a winged man, an angel. In art, Matthew's angel is often seen with him while the evangelist writes his gospel, as if inspiring or even dictating it to him. But this simple subject can take many different forms. In this early 9th century St. Matthew, by an unknown Carolingian artist, a painting on a page of a gospel book, and of course heading the Gospel of Matthew, we see Matthew seated, writing his gospel. You may wonder where his symbol, the angel, is, and if you don't look carefully, you won't see him. Matthew is seated in a landscape. There's some plants at his feet, there's a hill behind him, and the hill is crowned by some trees and a church-like structure, and on the right side stands the angel, holding a scroll, which unwinds in Matthew's direction. The visual connection, the related shapes of that scroll and Matthew's inkhorn is the artist's way of suggesting the divine inspiration or dictation that directs Matthew's writing. But this small painting does much more than show us Matthew writing his gospel while the angel inspires him, more even than placing it out of doors, which is an original idea on the artist's part. He also, the artist, has tried to understand the saint's state of mind while writing, and to convey that state of mind to us in his picture. That is the artist's interpretation. He has imagined that Matthew urgently wanted to pass on the good news, gospel means good news, to his readers. So he devises a style to express this idea. The style is intensely linear, and the lines of Matthew's robe are crisp, curvilinear, incessantly and insistently repetitive, and densely packed, full of energy. In his concentration, Matthew hunches over his writing table, and the curved lines of the hill behind him echo and reinforce this posture and its meaning. We often look first to the human face for emotional cues, and they're not lacking here. Matthew's eyebrows are raised in tight concentration, his eyes open wide. His hair is not merely curly, the curls snap with the same intensity found in the folds of his robe. Almost 800 years later, the Italian painter Caravaggio painted the same subject, twice in fact. This is Caravaggio's St. Matthew and the Angel, the first version that he painted about 1600. How did Caravaggio imagine his Matthew? He imagined that Matthew was not merely unlearned, but seemingly illiterate. We see this. The angel is not merely dictating, he guides Matthew's hand with his own. The strain of the demanding task is apparent in Matthew's furrowed brow, in his brawny forearm, in his tensely crossed legs. His whole body is focused on the mental challenge and is in complete contrast to the casual curved pose of the angel and the angel's elegant hand. But this angel, too, is solidly physical and literally down to earth. The patrons whose family chapel this painting was intended for rejected it as improper, indecorous, plebeian. The bare feet must have distressed them, especially the one nearly sticking out of the picture in our face. They failed completely to understand Caravaggio's intention, which was to make the evangelist a recognizable Italian of his own day, with whom an average visitor to the church, illiterate or barely literate, could readily identify, and through whom that visitor could feel the importance of the life of Jesus being so laboriously recorded. The identification of the viewer with the subject was important during Caravaggio's lifetime, when reforms in the Catholic Church were often aimed at making religion more relevant to all the people. Since the patron disliked this painting, For the wrong reasons, Caravaggio painted a second version. This second St. Matthew, probably painted about 1602, replaced the first in the chapel. Now the evangelist is dressed in flowing robes, suggesting an ancient philosopher, in fact, as in the 9th century book painting. And the angel stays properly in the air. He's still dictating, ticking off on his fingers the points to be written down, but there's no physical contact at all. Matthew is serious and intelligent and completely literate. Notice also that Matthew is set further back in space, pushed a little bit further, as it were, into the pictorial space at a greater distance from us than he is in either the book painting or Caravaggio's first version. It is a fine painting, but without the profound originality and immediacy of the first version. In looking at contrasting interpretations of this subject, we have also dealt explicitly with style. We couldn't do otherwise, since style is the means of the artist's interpretation. Now let's focus on style in two contrasting works of art. The history of art is rich in styles, and every style holds its particular expressive potential. It was once popular to judge or rate art with a Darwinian kind of assumption of progress in art, and this is still implicit in many people's response to art. Earlier styles, whose language is remote from us, are sometimes considered as lesser, incompletely realized artistic expressions. Here are two paintings of the same subject made 2 centuries apart in contrasting styles. Let us compare them briefly in one or two of their many aspects. The first is Roger van der Weyden's Deposition of 1435. And after that, I will show you Peter Paul Rubens' painting of the same subject from about 1612 to 14. Both paintings depict the lowering of the dead body of Christ from the cross. So different in some ways, so similar in others. Roger van der Weyden cares nothing for space except the shallow box in which the figures are gathered. A space that is not part of a real space, not a landscape setting. It suggests a container for painted sculpture. Yet the gold background of that box heightens the already extreme pathos of the grieving figures. Rubens places his figures outside at night, but the darkness obscures the landscape setting, isolating the figures from the rest of the world as much as van der Weyden's box did. And Rubens' black background is as much an amplifier of feeling as van der Weyden's gold. In each painting, the brilliant red robe of St. John intensifies the emotion. Although in van der Weyden's painting, John assists the fainting Virgin Mary, calling attention to the way her body echoes her son's, while in Rubens, John is supporting the body of Christ, the main subject. In each painting, the body of Christ dominates. One presented to us in an angular, stark frontal pose, the other slumped and lifeless, sliding down a long diagonal of sorrow. One may prefer one painter over the other, one style over the other, but one cannot deny that each artist has found a consummate expression of death and response to death. The particular expressivity of each artist could only be achieved in his particular personal style. In our discussion of interpretation and of style, we have also been deeply concerned with context. Once again, it could not have been otherwise, because the subjects we were dealing with were Christian subjects. And this brings us to context, and I want to begin by saying that Christianity informed much of European culture throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Baroque, and it remained a wellspring of subjects and themes well into the 18th century. We will spend a good deal of time looking at religious art, but to teach religious art is not to teach religion. One does not have to believe in order to be moved by the cultural expressions of religion, whether it be Handel's Messiah or Leonardo's Last Supper. I've often been asked if artists who painted religious subjects did so because they had to. No, they did so because Christianity was the principal communal component of their age. Just as one does not have to believe in a religion to be moved by its cultural expressions, so one does not have to believe in the divine right of kings or absolute monarchy in order to be awed by Louis XIV's great palace at Versailles, a palace that would never have been built in an era that was not autocratic and absolutist. We may disapprove of the political system, but we remain impressed by the achievement which resulted from its political context. Neither do we have to experience a political revolution to recognize the passionate response of a painter who witnessed the events of July 1830 in Paris, when the recently restored Bourbon regime was overthrown in a popular uprising. Eugène Delacroix painted his liberty leading the people immediately after the event. He could still think in the traditional allegorical mode in which liberty could be personified as a bare-breasted, heroic woman carrying the flag but leading the real people of Paris forward in their struggle. One thing we learn from this thrilling painting is that the power of contemporary events could stir the deepest emotions of an artist who was anything but a politically engaged person, and that he, through his genius, could enable us, long afterward, to share his response without ourselves having experienced the event or indeed a revolution. This brings us to emotion, because Delacroix's response to an immediate political context was also a profoundly emotional response. Each of us responds in our own way to events, circumstances, other persons, places, and experiences. Our response to joy or grief in real life will be evoked by the portrayals of those emotions in art. A particular example is our innate human response to a loving embrace. I show you Giotto, his meeting at the Golden Gate, painted about 1305. Giotto's fresco shows an aged couple, Joachim and Anna, who had been childless and who have just learned from angels that Anna will bear a child, Mary, who will become the mother of Jesus. They rush, she from their home and he from the fields, and they meet at the city gate. Although the couple are grouped with other people in an architectural setting, we focus at once on their memorable embrace. In fact, the arched gate leads our eyes to them, and its curve echoes their embrace. Their separate bodies fuse into one single loving form. Rembrandt painted the Jewish bride in 1668 or 69, and his painting brings us into the immediate presence of this Jewish couple whose names are not known to us. They're shown in a profoundly solemn embrace, in which they do not even look directly at one another, yet are ardently united by tender touch and by the warmth of her scarlet skirt and his golden sleeve, a sleeve that is itself the essence of an embrace. The couple in this portrait have been painted, by the way, in the guise of the loving Isaac and Rebekah from the Old Testament book of Genesis, and this deepens the meaning of the painting. The emotion in these paintings is both personal and religious, in both Giotto and Rembrandt, expressed in very different styles, but equally capable of touching us. As biblical and mythological themes became less common in the 19th century, the emotional content of art was often more directly related to individual pleasures and sorrows. Thus, art increasingly reflected the modern European middle class that arose in the 19th century and turned to their lives and experiences for subjects and for emotional expression. One great example may suffice. We feel a satisfying, complete pleasure in Renoir's famous Luncheon of the Boating Party, painted in 1881. The painting seems so obvious. That is, we understand it. We feel that it speaks our language, that this is our party. But does it? Is it? No. It's merely much closer to our own time and free from references drawn from anything outside itself. In fact, few of us have ever been at such a boating party after rowing down a river to a favorite restaurant. No, the emotion, the pleasure that we feel in this painting comes from Renoir's own joy in the scene and his absolute mastery of color and characterization and composition, a composition that leaves a place for us, the concave opening at the front of the table, a place to pull up our own chair. Everything in this painting combines to convince us that we're included in this long ago gathering of friends. Let me point out one aspect of the color doing that. You see this reddish orange, it changes from time to time in her hat. Look up at the awning, and especially at the piping of the awning, the edging of it. That color goes round until it drops down into the ribbon on the costume of the lady here, jumps back to an orange on the shoulder of the man at the back, moves across to the right side, where it is seen in the hat of the gentleman in the middle, down to extraordinarily brilliant orange lips for the gentleman here, and down from him into the red which electrifies the collar of this woman, and then moving to the liqueurs in the liqueur glass. That one color is used like a thread that goes through the whole painting and pulls it together like a tapestry, really. There is one other thing about the painting that makes us feel that these people, these middle-class people, are known to us and that we are part of their world, and that is the grouping of them. You have on the left, apparently a couple, yet he looks in one direction and she's absorbed in her dog. On the right-hand side, you have three. He looks down at her, she looks at him, and I think he looks across the table at the woman with the dog. This is good stage direction, and it also involves us personally in it. We share the emotion for this reason. Remember that we've been using these examples of European art to provide a foundation, a guide, some tools to assist in looking at the hundreds of works of art that this course will present. I have also been trying to suggest what pleasures lie in store for us. And in the process, I hope that I've also hinted at my conviction that art is important, something that when properly seen and considered and felt can change our lives for the better. Like great music and great literature, art is civilizing. And we human beings need all the civilizing we can get. I look forward to sharing part of the world of art with you, and I thank you for your attention.